One choice. One moment. One love story. Welcome to When He Chose Her. Enjoy the story. The world is cruel to people who can't pay for dinner. But sometimes, the cruelest people are the ones pretending they can. Rain hammered the streets of downtown Chicago hard enough to blur the traffic lights into streaks of red and gold across the wet pavement. Inside Rosie's diner, the air smelled like burnt coffee, maple syrup, and tired people trying to survive another Thursday night. Clara Ellison balanced 3 plates along her arm, while a country song crackled softly from the old jukebox near the door. Her feet hurt. Her lower back hurt. And the man at table 6 had just sent back his fries for the 3rd time because they were too crispy. You know fries are supposed to be crispy, right? Clara muttered under her breath as she walked toward the kitchen. What was that? Shouted the cook from behind the grill. Nothing, Frank. Just arguing with God again. Frank barked out a laugh while grease hissed across the flat top. Clara smiled faintly, but the exhaustion in her blue eyes never really disappeared. She had been awake since 5 that morning. 2 jobs. 1 sick father at home. Rent due in 4 days. And exactly $48 in her checking account. Outside, thunder rolled low across the city. Then the bell above the diner door rang. Everyone looked up for half a second before immediately losing interest. The man standing there looked like trouble in the shape of exhaustion. Tall, broad shoulders hidden beneath a soaked charcoal coat that had clearly seen better years. Dark hair damp from rain. Light stubble across his jaw. He looked like someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. More importantly, he looked broke. One customer near the counter quietly picked up her purse and moved it closer to her lap. Another man wrinkled his nose before returning to his burger. The stranger noticed all of it. His expression never changed. Nolan Whitaker stood still for a moment, letting the warmth of the diner hit his face. 3 days ago, he had stepped out of a private jet worth $50 million. Tonight, he looked like a man who couldn't afford bus fare. Funny how fast respect disappeared when expensive watches did. Clara approached with a coffee pot in one hand and her order pad in the other. Kitchen closes in 20 minutes, she said softly. But coffee's still alive somehow. One corner of Nolan's mouth almost moved. Almost. That sounds optimistic. It's Chicago, Clara replied. Optimism is all we have after October. A few people nearby chuckled quietly. Nolan noticed something strange immediately. She wasn't nervous around him. She wasn't overly sweet either. No fake smile. No judgment. Just calm. Like she had already met every kind of person the world could create and decided none of them impressed her anymore. Can I get you something to eat? She asked. Nolan hesitated just long enough to make the performance believable. Depends how much coffee costs. The silence at the nearest booth was instant. One businessman smirked into his glass. Clara looked at Nolan carefully. Really looked at him. The wet coat. The tired eyes. The pride hidden beneath embarrassment. Then she quietly reached beneath the counter, grabbed a ceramic mug, and filled it with fresh coffee. On the house, she said. You look like someone who forgot how cold the world can be. Nolan froze for half a second. Not visibly, but internally, something shifted. In his world, kindness usually came attached to contracts, cameras, or expectations. This felt different. Clara slid the mug toward him. Sit wherever you want. Except table 4. Nolan glanced toward table 4. Why? Legs broken. Unless you enjoy near-death experiences. Another small laugh escaped him before he could stop it. He moved toward the booth beside the window while rainwater dripped from his coat onto the old checkered floor. Clara returned a few minutes later with a bowl of chicken soup and half a grilled cheese sandwich. I didn't order this, Nolan said. I know. Then I can't accept it. Clara tilted her head slightly. You planning to fight me over soup? I don't take charity. Good. She pointed toward the kitchen. Then you can help me carry boxes after closing and pretend this is employment. Nolan stared at her. She said it so casually. No pity. No performance. Just dignity handed quietly from one exhausted human being to another. He glanced down at the soup again. Steam curled upward between them. You always hire strangers this fast? He asked. Clara shrugged. Only the ones that look too stubborn to ask for help. Across the diner, 2 college kids burst out laughing at something on a phone. Plates clinked softly behind the counter. Rain crawled down the windows in silver streaks. And for the first time in longer than Nolan Whitaker wanted to admit, nobody in the room cared how much money he had. Clara started walking away before stopping suddenly. One condition, though. Nolan looked up. No creepy serial killer behavior while taking out trash. A tired laugh escaped him before he could stop it completely. Clara pointed a finger toward him triumphantly. There it is. What? Proof you're not dead inside. Nolan watched her disappear back toward the kitchen while the old diner lights flickered gently overhead. He had spent years surrounded by models, executives, investors, and women who memorized his net worth before learning his favorite color. But somehow, a waitress with tired eyes and coffee-stained sneakers had managed to do something none of them ever could. She made him feel seen without trying to see his money first. The funny thing about pretending to be poor is discovering how many rich people are spiritually bankrupt. The rain finally stopped a little after midnight, leaving downtown Chicago wrapped in silver reflections and cold wind that slipped between buildings like a whisper. Rosie's diner was officially closed, but the lights in the kitchen still glowed warm against the dark street outside. Clara Ellison stood near the storage room balancing 3 heavy produce boxes against her hip, while Frank argued loudly with an ancient microwave that had apparently decided retirement sounded better than another winter. If this thing explodes, Frank shouted, tell my ex-wife she still owes me $40. Clara laughed softly as Nolan carried another stack of canned goods toward the pantry shelves. His expensive life had not prepared him for lifting restaurant inventory at 1 o'clock in the morning. He was fairly certain his shoulders were filing formal complaints against him already. You are holding those boxes wrong, Clara said without looking at him. I am holding them successfully. Barely. Bend your knees more. Nolan adjusted awkwardly. You sound suspiciously qualified for this. Clara slid another crate onto the shelf with surprising strength. 3 years in a diner teaches survival skills. Like carrying 50 pounds of potatoes and pretending customers are not emotionally exhausting. Nolan smiled faintly. There it was again. That strange warmth in her voice. Dry humor wrapped around exhaustion. No performance. No desperation to impress him. She treated him the same way she treated everyone else in the diner. Maybe even harsher. The realization should have annoyed him. Instead, it felt peaceful. Outside, wind rattled softly against the windows while Clara wiped down the counter for the 3rd time that night. Nolan watched her quietly. The small movements. The careful routines. The way she folded napkins perfectly even when nobody would notice. Most people in his world rushed through details because money cleaned up mistakes later. Clara moved like details mattered because nobody else would fix them for her. You always stay this late? He asked. Most nights. That sounds miserable. It is. She shrugged casually. But misery pays hourly. Nolan leaned against the counter, studying her. You joke a lot for someone exhausted. Clara poured herself stale coffee and grimaced immediately after tasting it. I work in customer service. Humor is cheaper than therapy. Another laugh escaped him before he could stop it. Clara pointed toward him again with the coffee mug. See? That almost sounded human. Nolan shook his head slowly. You enjoy bullying homeless people? Only the dramatic ones. She walked past him toward the front windows, flipping the sign from open to closed completely even though they had shut down an hour earlier. Neon light flickered softly across her face. So, she said carefully, what happened? Nolan stiffened slightly. What do you mean? You have educated hands. He blinked once. Educated hands. No. Construction scars. No grease stains. No nicotine fingers. Clara tilted her head. But your shoes cost more than my monthly electric bill. Nolan looked down instinctively at the worn leather shoes he had intentionally scuffed earlier that week. Apparently not enough. You notice a lot. Occupational hazard. She crossed her arms lightly. People tell you who they are before they speak. Most just hope nobody is paying attention. Nolan held her gaze for a long moment. This was dangerous territory. 3 days into the experiment, and already someone was looking too closely. Let us say, he replied slowly, life changed recently. Clara nodded once like she understood more than he said aloud. Girlfriend? Nolan laughed quietly under his breath. That obvious? You have the face of someone who recently discovered love songs are lies. The accuracy hit harder than expected. Nolan glanced away toward the dark street outside. 3 weeks ago, he had stood outside a hotel ballroom listening to his fiancée laugh with her friends while she described him as a reliable investment with a pulse. Not a man. Not someone she loved. An investment. He remembered the champagne glass in his hand going completely still while the music continued behind him like nothing happened. Something like that, he admitted softly. Clara's expression softened for the first time all night. Not pity, just recognition. Well, she said quietly, for what it is worth, people who love money usually leave when life gets inconvenient. Nolan looked back at her. And people who do not. Clara stared toward the rain-soaked windows. They stay when the heat breaks, the rent is late, and dinner is cereal at midnight. Silence settled gently between them. Somewhere in the kitchen, Frank sneezed violently and yelled at the microwave again. The moment broke just enough for Clara to smile faintly. You got anywhere to sleep tonight? Nolan hesitated deliberately. Not exactly. Clara disappeared behind the counter before returning with a folded piece of paper and a set of keys attached to a faded Cubs keychain. Nolan frowned immediately. What is this? My cousin owns an apartment above the laundromat. On Clark Street. He moved to Milwaukee last month. She placed the keys in front of him. The heater sounds possessed, but it works if you kick it twice. Nolan stared at the keys without touching them. You are giving apartment keys to a stranger. Temporary keys, Clara corrected. And if you steal my television, congratulations. You now own the worst television in Illinois. Nolan looked at her carefully. Why would you trust me? Clara thought about it for a second. Because everybody looks dangerous when they are having the worst week of their life. The old diner lights buzzed softly overhead. Nolan swallowed unexpectedly hard. In his world, trust usually arrived hidden behind contracts worth millions. This woman handed it out with a tired smile and a keychain shaped like a baseball team. Clara, he said quietly. What if I am lying? She met his eyes calmly. Then that says something about you. Not me. And somehow, standing in a nearly empty diner that smelled like coffee and dish soap, Nolan Whitaker felt poorer than he ever had in his entire life. Some people spend their whole lives searching for honest love while lying about who they are the entire time. Morning arrived gray and bitterly cold over Chicago. Steam curled from subway grates while exhausted commuters moved through downtown with coffee cups clutched like survival equipment. Nolan Whitaker stood outside the laundromat apartment Clara had lent him, staring down at the Cubs keychain in his palm like it weighed more than gold. The apartment itself had been tiny. One creaking bed, a heater that sounded exactly as advertised, somewhere between a dying tractor and a haunted accordion. And yet Nolan had slept better there than he had inside his $20 million penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan. No security team, no assistants, no investors calling at midnight. Just silence. Real silence. He slipped the keys into his coat pocket and walked 6 blocks toward Rosie's diner while cold wind cut through the city streets. Halfway there, his phone vibrated for the first time in almost 20 hours. 7 missed calls. 12 messages. 1 voicemail marked urgent. Nolan ignored all of them. Bye? Now the board was probably panicking. The media had already noticed Whitaker Capital's billionaire founder disappearing from public view after canceling a major engagement announcement. Good. Let them panic for once. Rosie's diner looked different in daylight. Less cinematic. More tired. The faded red sign buzzed weakly above the entrance while delivery trucks crowded the curb outside. Nolan stepped inside and immediately got hit by the smell of bacon, coffee, and maple syrup. Clara stood behind the counter scribbling orders while balancing 2 plates along one arm like a professional circus act. Table 3 wants extra syrup. Table 5 says their eggs are emotionally disappointing. Table 7 keeps asking if gluten is a government conspiracy. She glanced up and spotted Nolan near the door. Well, she said dryly, look who survived the haunted heater. Nolan walked toward the counter holding up the apartment keys. Barely. Clara nodded approvingly. Good. Builds character. She grabbed the keys from his hand and dropped them into her apron pocket without ceremony. Nolan noticed dark circles beneath her eyes this morning. More than last night. Did you even sleep? He asked. Clara poured coffee for an elderly customer before answering. 3 hours. That sounds unhealthy. Poverty usually is. She said it casually. Like weather. Like gravity. Nolan felt something tighten quietly in his chest. He had spent years discussing poverty inside conference rooms with market analysts and economic projections. Clara talked about it like an annoying roommate that never moved out. Frank emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of pancakes. Hey, mystery man, he grunted toward Nolan. If you are hanging around here again, Congratulations. You officially work here now. Clara pointed toward a stack of delivery boxes near the entrance. Actually, perfect timing. You can help unload produce. Nolan stared at the mountain of crates. How much produce does one diner need? Enough to survive customers who think avocado toast counts as a personality. 20 minutes later, Nolan found himself carrying 50-pound potato sacks beside Clara through the diner's back entrance while icy wind slapped against the alley walls. A delivery driver watched him struggle with one particularly heavy crate and muttered, "City boy." Nolan shot him a glare, while Clara laughed openly for the first time since meeting him. The sound surprised him. Warm, unfiltered, real. "You enjoying this?" he asked. "Immensely." She pushed open the storage door with her shoulder. "Watching rich-looking men lose fights against vegetables heals something in me spiritually." Nolan stopped halfway into the pantry. "Rich-looking?" Clara froze for a fraction of a second before pretending to organize onions. "Did I say rich?" "You did." "Interesting." Nolan narrowed his eyes slightly. "You think I look rich?" Clara avoided eye contact suspiciously fast. "You alphabetize canned soup when nervous. That is not an answer. And you say thank you to bus drivers automatically." She glanced at him finally. "Poor people usually stop doing that after New York." Nolan blinked once. "You have met a lot of homeless investment bankers?" Clara leaned casually against the shelf. "No, but I grew up around wealthy people." Her voice changed slightly. "Quieter now. My mother cleaned houses on the north side when I was a kid. Rich people have habits. Expensive watches. Careless confidence. They never check price tags first." Nolan folded his arms carefully. "And what habits do poor people have?" Clara thought for a second. "They apologize before asking for help." Silence settled softly between them. Somewhere near the front counter, dishes clinked and an old blues song played from the radio. Nolan studied Clara closely now. Maybe too closely. "You notice everything, do you?" Clara smiled faintly. "Only the things people try hardest to hide." Before Nolan could respond, the diner door slammed open hard enough to shake the windows. A sharply dressed man in an expensive navy coat stormed inside, scanning the room frantically. His polished shoes splashed melted snow across the floor. Then his eyes landed directly on Nolan. The man's entire expression changed instantly from panic to disbelief. "Mr. Witt," he started loudly before Nolan cut him off with one sharp look. Clara noticed it. Immediately. The pause. The tension. The way the stranger suddenly corrected himself. "Nick," the man said awkwardly. "There you are." Clara slowly looked between them while Nolan felt the first crack forming in the fragile little world he had built inside Rosie's diner. The hardest part about pretending to be someone else is remembering which version of yourself deserves the truth. The diner went strangely quiet for half a second. Not fully silent. Plates still clinked in the kitchen. Coffee still poured somewhere near the counter. But Clara felt the air change immediately the moment the man in the navy coat walked in. He looked expensive. Not just wealthy. Controlled wealthy. The kind of man who probably apologized to nobody and owned several buildings without ever entering them. Nolan straightened instinctively beside the pantry shelves while the newcomer approached quickly, lowering his voice at the last second. "Nick," the man corrected awkwardly, though panic still flickered across his face. "I have been trying to reach you for 12 hours. Clara crossed her arms lightly. That is impressive dedication for someone who apparently does not know his friend's name. The man blinked once. Nolan closed his eyes briefly like a headache had just arrived wearing dress shoes. "Clara," he said carefully, "this is Daniel." Daniel extended a hand immediately. "Daniel Mercer." Clara shook it politely. "Clara Ellison." Daniel smiled too fast. "Lovely place." Frank yelled from the kitchen. "If you break anything, you buy it." Daniel looked startled. Clara did not. Her eyes moved slowly between the two men again. One exhausted in a borrowed coat. One standing in polished Italian leather shoes worth more than the diner's monthly coffee budget. They clearly knew each other. Too clearly. Nolan noticed the shift in her expression immediately. She was thinking now. Connecting details. "You said your phone was disconnected?" Clara said casually. Nolan nodded once. "It was." Daniel coughed into his fist hard enough to sound almost theatrical. "Temporary issue," Nolan added quickly. Clara leaned against the counter. "Interesting. Because most disconnected phones do not come with men in $1,000 coats looking terrified." Daniel looked at Nolan like a hostage begging silently for instructions. Nolan rubbed a hand across his jaw slowly. This was supposed to be simple. 1 week outside his real life. 1 week proving his ex-fiancée right or wrong about humanity. Instead, he was standing inside a diner being psychologically dismantled by a waitress with tired eyes and terrifying observational skills. "Can we talk outside?" Daniel asked quietly. Nolan hesitated. Clara grabbed the coffee pot before either man could move. "Take your time," she said calmly. "But if either of you are secretly part of the mafia, please do not involve Table 7. They already complained about emotional damage from the pancakes." Daniel stared at her. "She jokes during tension?" "Constantly," Nolan muttered. Outside, cold wind swept through the alley behind the diner while delivery trucks rattled past on the main street. Daniel lowered his voice immediately. "The board is losing their minds." Nolan shoved his hands into his coat pockets. Good. Daniel stared at him incredulously. "You vanished after canceling the engagement party. Reporters are outside your penthouse. Investors think you had a breakdown." Nolan looked toward the diner windows where Clara moved between tables carrying coffee mugs with quiet efficiency. "Maybe I did." Daniel followed his gaze. "This is about her. This is about everybody." Nolan's voice stayed calm, but quieter now. 3 days pretending to have nothing, and suddenly people stop looking at you like a human being. Waiters ignore you. Taxi drivers refuse rides. Store employees follow you around like you are stealing oxygen. Daniel folded his arms. "You are discovering society. Congratulations." Nolan almost smiled. Except she did not. Daniel glanced toward Clara again. "Careful." "Why?" "Because women like her are dangerous." Nolan's eyes narrowed instantly. Daniel raised both hands. "Not dangerous like manipulative. Dangerous because they make men with money start questioning themselves." Silence settled between them. Wind scraped trash gently across the alley pavement. "You are already attached," Daniel said. Quietly. Nolan did not answer immediately. That alone was answer enough. Back inside the diner, Clara refilled coffee for an elderly customer while pretending not to watch the alley through the windows every 30 seconds. She hated that she was curious. Curiosity usually led to disappointment. Wealthy men especially came with complications wrapped in confidence. She knew the type. Her mother spent 20 years cleaning houses for people who smiled politely while treating workers like background furniture. Yet Nolan did not act like them. That was the problem. Frank approached beside her holding a tray of pie slices. "Your homeless boyfriend looks expensive." Clara nearly dropped the coffee pot. "He is not my boyfriend." "Good. Because emotionally complicated men tip terribly." Clara rolled her eyes, but she was smiling slightly when Nolan and Daniel finally returned inside. Daniel approached the counter first and quietly placed several crisp $100 bills beside the register. Clara immediately pushed them back toward him. "We are not accepting donations." Daniel blinked. "It is for the inconvenience." The inconvenience was watching a grown man lose a fistfight against potato boxes. Clara nodded toward Nolan. "We survived." Nolan looked suspiciously amused while Daniel stared between them like he had accidentally walked into another planet. Most people around Billionaires performed. Clara challenged. Teased. Corrected. It unsettled him. "At least let me pay for breakfast," Daniel insisted. Clara considered it carefully. "Fine." Daniel relaxed visibly. "Great. But only because your face says you have never eaten diner pancakes before, and honestly that feels tragic." Nolan laughed quietly under his breath, while Daniel looked genuinely offended. Clara pointed toward a booth near the window. "Sit down, fancy coat. Today we fix your personality with maple syrup." And for the first time in years, Nolan Whitaker realized he was not counting minutes until he could leave a room. Sometimes the richest people in the room are the ones who still know how to give without announcing it. Snow started falling again just after lunch. Thick, slow flakes drifted across downtown Chicago while traffic crawled through gray streets lined with glowing storefronts and exhausted office workers. Inside Rosie's diner, the lunch rush finally faded into the softer rhythm of clinking dishes and half-empty coffee cups. Daniel Mercer sat stiffly in the booth near the window, staring suspiciously at a plate of pancakes like they had personally insulted him. Clara dropped the syrup bottle onto the table. "You are thinking too hard." Daniel looked up cautiously. "About pancakes?" "About life." She nodded toward the plate. "Pancakes are emotionally simple. That is their strength." Across from him, Nolan nearly choked on his coffee, trying not to laugh. Daniel pointed a fork toward Clara. Does she always speak like this? Unfortunately, yes, Nolan answered. Clara gasped dramatically. Excuse you. I am delightful. Frank shouted from the kitchen. Debatable. Clara pointed toward the kitchen without looking away from the booth. Your grilled cheese is burning again. A loud curse immediately followed from behind the swinging kitchen doors. Nolan leaned back against the booth watching her move through the diner. Every customer interaction felt effortless. She remembered names. Refills. Which old veteran preferred extra bacon but pretended not to because of his blood pressure? Which college student quietly split one meal across 6 hours because his paycheck had not arrived yet? She noticed everything. And somehow she carried all of it without making people feel pitted. Daniel lowered his voice once Clara walked away. You realize this has gone far beyond your original experiment. Nolan stared into his coffee silently. Maybe. You were supposed to disappear for a few days. Sleep in a cheap apartment. Regain perspective. Not become emotionally attached to a waitress who insults millionaires recreationally. Nolan smiled faintly into the mug. Billionaires. What? She insults billionaires recreationally. Daniel groaned softly. You are smiling now. This is serious. Before Nolan could answer, Clara returned carrying a paper bag filled with sandwiches. I need a favor, she announced. Daniel immediately looked nervous. Why do I feel like this favor involves manual labor? Because your face says you have never carried anything heavier than stock options. Clara slid the paper bag toward Nolan. Soup Kitchen on Wabash needs extra food delivered before 4. Frank usually drives it over, but his truck died again. Frank appeared from the kitchen holding a wrench covered in grease. Transmission surrendered to capitalism. Clara nodded solemnly. May it rest in peace. Nolan looked at the bag. You want us to deliver food? Correct. Daniel blinked. Us. Clara smiled sweetly. Congratulations. Today you both experience community service and weather at the same time. 20 minutes later, Nolan and Daniel stood outside in falling snow, carrying trays of soup containers through crowded downtown sidewalks, while Clara walked ahead, wearing a faded blue coat and knitted gloves with tiny holes near the fingertips. Daniel looked deeply offended by the entire experience. My shoes cost $1,200. Clara kept walking. Excellent. Maybe they can afford therapy afterward. Nolan laughed under his breath while balancing a tray of sandwiches carefully against the cold wind. Something about this felt absurdly normal. No security detail. No luxury cars. Just snow, traffic noise, and Clara Ellison marching through downtown Chicago like she had personally declared war against sadness. The shelter on Wabash sat between an old church and a laundromat with flickering neon lights. Warm air rushed over them the moment they stepped inside, carrying the smell of soup, detergent, and old winter coats drying near radiators. Volunteers moved quickly through the crowded room, handing out meals, while children colored at folding tables near the back wall. Clara immediately became someone different there. Softer. Quieter. She knelt beside an elderly woman adjusting blankets around her shoulders before helping a little boy open a juice box that refused cooperation. Nolan watched silently. She did not perform kindness. She inhabited it naturally. Like breathing. One volunteer approached Clara smiling warmly. You came. Told you I would. Clara pointed toward Nolan and Daniel. I also kidnapped 2 emotionally confused businessmen. Daniel looked mildly offended. I am emotionally organized. Your face says otherwise. The volunteer laughed and handed Clara another tray of food containers. Nolan noticed several people greeting her by name. Not politely. Affectionately. Like she belonged there. How often do you come here? He asked quietly while helping unload soup cups. Clara shrugged. Whenever I can. Even after double shifts. People still get hungry after I am tired. Nolan looked at her carefully. Snow melted slowly against the shelter windows behind her, while soft Christmas music played somewhere near the kitchen. You do all this for free? Clara frowned slightly. That is usually how helping works. The simplicity of the answer hit harder than criticism ever could. Nolan suddenly remembered charity galas inside crystal ballrooms, where executives donated millions, while photographers documented every angle of generosity. Clara carried soup through snowstorms without posting a single picture about it. A little girl near the back corner suddenly tugged Clara's sleeve. Miss Clara, she whispered shyly. Are your friends rich? Clara glanced toward Nolan and Daniel thoughtfully. Emotionally? Not yet. Nolan laughed quietly before he could stop himself. The little girl grinned triumphantly like she had accomplished something important. Clara handed her an extra cookie from the paper bag. "Do not tell the others," she whispered dramatically. "This is organized crime now." The little girl giggled and ran off toward the folding tables while Nolan stood there watching Clara beneath the warm shelter lights. And for the first time in years, he felt something terrifyingly unfamiliar beginning to grow inside him. Not attraction, not curiosity, something quieter, something honest. A lie becomes dangerous the moment someone starts loving the person hiding behind it. Snow covered Chicago in soft white silence by the time Nolan and Daniel returned to Rosie's diner that evening. Streetlights glowed gold against icy sidewalks while tired commuters hurried through the cold with collars raised high against the wind. Inside the diner, the warmth hit instantly. Coffee, bacon, grease, old music from the jukebox humming quietly near the counter. Clara stood balancing receipts while arguing with the register under her breath. "You and I both know math is fake," she muttered while stabbing buttons aggressively. Frank walked past carrying clean dishes. "That machine is older than both of us combined." "So is your attitude," Clara shot back. Nolan stopped near the entrance watching her quietly. She had no idea how rare she was. People with money often confuse generosity with convenience. Clara gave pieces of herself away constantly even when it cost her sleep, comfort, or sanity. Daniel noticed Nolan staring and sighed heavily. "You are in trouble." Nolan did not answer. Because for once Daniel was right. Clara looked up and spotted them near the door. "There they are." She pointed dramatically. "My unpaid interns returned from super-related crime." Daniel removed his coat carefully. "I am never carrying chili through a snowstorm again." That is exactly what someone with weak character would say. Nolan smiled despite himself while Clara grabbed 2 mugs and filled them with coffee. She slid one toward Daniel and one toward Nolan automatically without asking what they wanted. Somehow she already knew. "Long day?" Nolan asked quietly. Clara nodded once. "Dad had another doctor appointment this morning." Her voice stayed calm, but Nolan noticed the exhaustion immediately. "Everything okay?" Clara stirred sugar into her coffee absent-mindedly. "Depends what your definition of okay is." Frank lowered the kitchen music slightly while pretending not to listen. Clara stared down into the mug for a moment before speaking again. "Insurance stopped covering one of his medications last month. Apparently staying alive is now considered a luxury feature." Nolan felt anger rise instantly. Sharp. Immediate. Not at Clara. At the world. At systems. At the fact that someone like her spent nights delivering soup to strangers while struggling to keep her own father healthy. "How much is it?" he asked before thinking. Clara looked up immediately. "No," Nolan blinked. "I did not even say anything yet." "You were about to offer money." "Maybe." Clara shook her head gently. "Do not." Silence settled softly between them while snow drifted outside the windows. "Clara," Nolan said carefully, "there is nothing wrong with accepting help sometimes." She smiled faintly, but sadness touched the edges of it now. "That depends who the help comes from." Nolan frowned slightly. Clara leaned against the counter, eyes distant for the first time since he met her. "My mother spent years cleaning houses for rich families." Her voice stayed soft. "They always acted generous right before reminding us we needed them." Nolan stayed quiet. "One woman used to leave leftover cake slices for me after parties." Clara laughed softly without humor. "Then she would tell her friends how rewarding charity felt while I stood there holding napkins." The diner suddenly felt quieter around them. Smaller somehow. "People like feeling powerful," Clara continued. "Especially when someone else is struggling." Nolan swallowed hard because every word felt aimed directly at him even though she had no idea who he really was. "So now," Clara said softly, "I would rather survive honestly than owe someone my dignity." Nolan looked at her for a long moment. The fluorescent diner lights reflected softly in her tired blue eyes. She was not proud in the loud way wealthy people admired. Her pride was quieter, protective, built from years of humiliation nobody ever apologized for. Daniel cleared his throat awkwardly from the booth near the window, sensing emotional danger approaching fast. "I should probably head out." Clara nodded. "Drive safe, fancy coat." Daniel stood, but before leaving, he glanced briefly toward Nolan. The look lasted less than a second. Clara noticed it anyway. Nolan noticed her noticing. Daniel walked toward the door before suddenly stopping. Actually, he said casually. Nick, your interview tomorrow morning is still confirmed, right? Nolan froze internally. Clara looked between them instantly. Interview. Daniel smiled too quickly again. Warehouse job. Clara narrowed her eyes slightly. Warehouse jobs have interviews now. Daniel opened the door fast. Competitive industry. Then he disappeared into the snow before anyone could ask more questions. Clara slowly turned back toward Nolan. You are a terrible liar, you know that? Nolan leaned against the counter carefully. What makes you say that? You paused before fake details. She took another sip of coffee. And nobody named Nick folds napkins like a Fortune 500 executive. Nolan laughed quietly despite the panic slowly forming in his chest. Fortune 500? Please. Clara pointed toward him. You apologized to the bus driver yesterday because somebody else stepped on his shoe. Nolan rubbed his forehead tiredly. That does sound suspiciously wealthy. Clara smiled faintly, but this time something else flickered beneath it. Curiosity. Concern. Maybe even disappointment waiting quietly in advance. Whatever your real story is, she said softly. Just make sure it is honest eventually. Nolan felt the words land heavily somewhere deep inside him. Because suddenly he realized something terrifying. He no longer wanted Clara to love the lie. He wanted her to survive the truth. The truth rarely destroys relationships. What destroys them is realizing the truth arrived too late. Chicago woke beneath freezing rain the next morning. Ice-coated sidewalks and thin silver layers while traffic reports warned drivers to stay home if possible. Inside Rosie's diner, every booth was full by 7:30. Construction workers crowded near the counter. Nurses in blue scrubs clutched giant coffees like lifelines. The old jukebox crackled softly beneath the noise of dishes and conversation. Clara moved through the chaos with practiced speed, balancing plates along her arm while somehow remembering 6 different orders at once. Nolan sat quietly near the window stirring untouched coffee. He barely slept. Every conversation from the night before kept replaying inside his head. Just make sure it is honest eventually. The words followed him everywhere now. Clara approached carrying a fresh pot of coffee. You look terrible. Nolan glanced up tiredly. Good morning to you too. No, seriously. She refilled his mug. You have the face of a man being hunted by tax fraud or emotions. Nolan almost smiled. Maybe both. Clara leaned briefly against the booth. Warehouse interview today. There it was. Calm voice. Sharp eyes. Nolan nodded slowly. Something like that. Clara studied him carefully for a second too long. You know, she said quietly, most lies fall apart because people try too hard to protect them. Before Nolan could respond, the television mounted near the diner counter suddenly changed from weather reports to breaking business news. We interrupt this broadcast for a developing story involving Whitaker Capital so Nolan Whitaker. Nolan froze instantly. Across the diner, Daniel Mercer's face appeared briefly beside reporters outside a glass skyscraper downtown. Clara turned automatically toward the screen while the news anchor continued speaking. Sources say billionaire Nolan Whitaker has remained missing from public appearances for nearly a week following the sudden cancellation of his engagement to socialite Vanessa Beaumont. Every sound inside Nolan's head disappeared. Clara stared at the television, then slowly back toward him. The screen showed a clear photograph now. Nolan in a tailored black suit stepping out of a limousine beside flashing cameras. Same eyes, same jawline, same quiet expression she had memorized over the last several days. The coffee pot slipped slightly in Clara's hand before she steadied it. Around them, customers kept eating, barely paying attention. Nobody noticed the world ending quietly inside booth number 4. Nolan stood slowly. Clara, she laughed once. Softly, not amused. Nick. The fake name sounded strange now. Small. Embarrassing. Nolan opened his mouth carefully. I can explain. Clara set the coffee pot down with controlled precision. You are Nolan Whitaker. Not a question. A fact. Nolan nodded once. Silence. Heavy now? The billionaire. Another nod. Clara stared at him for a long moment while rain tapped softly against the diner windows. You slept in that apartment with a $7 billion bank account. Nolan swallowed hard. Yes. You unloaded potatoes for fun. No, he shook his head quickly. Not for fun. Clara folded her arms tightly. Then what exactly was this? Nolan looked around the diner helplessly like answers might be hidden. Between syrup bottles and cracked vinyl booths. I needed to know if people could still. He stopped himself. Clara's eyes narrowed painfully. Still what? Nolan forced himself to say it honestly. Care. The word hung between them like broken glass. Clara looked away briefly toward the television screen, still flashing his name beneath stock market updates. So I was part of some experiment. No. Nolan stepped forward immediately. Clara. It stopped being that almost immediately. She laughed again quietly. This time it hurt worse. That is somehow not comforting. Frank emerged from the kitchen, carrying toast before noticing the tension instantly. Why does everybody suddenly look emotionally flammable? Clara did not answer him. Her eyes stayed fixed on Nolan. How long were you planning to lie? I was trying to tell you. When? Her voice remained calm, which somehow felt more devastating. After I trusted you more? After I told you about my father? Nolan felt every word hit exactly where it deserved. You are right, he said quietly. I was wrong. Clara looked at him carefully then. Really looked. Not at the billionaire from television. At the man who carried soup through snowstorms and laughed at terrible diner jokes, and folded napkins too neatly when nervous. That was the worst part. Some of him had been real. Did you enjoy it? She asked softly. Nolan frowned. What? Watching the poor waitress prove she had a good heart. The shame in his expression answered before he could speak. Clara nodded slowly to herself. Of course. Nolan stepped closer carefully. Clara, I never wanted to hurt you. No. Her blue eyes finally met his again. Right now. Wounded. You just wanted to test whether people like me were honest enough to deserve your trust. The diner suddenly felt too warm. Too small. Nolan could not breathe properly. Clara untied her apron slowly and placed it on the counter beside the register. I need air. Please let me explain. She looked at him one last time. Quietly. The problem is, her voice trembled for the first time since he met her. I think I would have liked you even without the money. Then she walked past him and out into the freezing Chicago rain while Nolan Whitaker stood motionless beneath the diner lights, realizing that somehow losing the trust of one exhausted waitress hurt more than losing half his fortune ever could. Money can buy forgiveness speeches, expensive flowers, and 5-star apologies. But trust only returns when pride finally leaves the room. 3 days passed without Clara answering a single message. Chicago remained buried beneath freezing rain and dirty snow while Nolan Whitaker moved through board meetings like a ghost wearing an expensive suit. The polished glass walls of Whitaker Capital reflected a version of him he barely recognized anymore. Assistants followed him through hallways carrying reports worth millions of dollars. Investors shook his hand. Journalists shouted questions outside elevators. None of it mattered, because every quiet moment between meetings dragged him back to Rosie's diner, to coffee-stain counters, to Clara laughing at his inability to carry potatoes correctly, to the look in her eyes when she realized he lied. Daniel stood inside Nolan's office watching him ignore another untouched lunch. You know, Daniel said carefully, most billionaires recover from emotional devastation with yachts. Nolan stared out the skyscraper windows toward the gray city below. I preferred the diner coffee. Daniel sighed heavily. You are impossible. No, Nolan adjusted his cuff slowly. I was arrogant. Silence settled between them while snow tapped softly against the massive windows. You really care about her, Daniel said quietly. Nolan smiled once without humor. She treated me like a human being before she knew who I was. And after? Nolan looked down at the city streets, nearly 40 floors below. After, she treated me like I deserved the truth. Meanwhile, across town, Clara moved through Rosie's diner with mechanical precision. Smile. Coffee refill. Order pad. Repeat. Customers noticed she laughed less now. Frank noticed she stared at the door every time it opened before pretending she had not. You are mad because you liked him, Frank muttered while wiping down plates beside her. Clara poured coffee aggressively. I am mad because he lied. People lie when they are scared. Clara shook her head. Rich people lie when they want control. Frank studied her quietly. And poor people? Clara stopped moving for half a second. Poor people lie because truth is expensive. The old diner bell rang suddenly above the entrance. Clara looked up instinctively. Not Nolan. A sharply dressed woman stepped inside wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than Clara's car. Perfect blonde hair. Diamond earrings. Cold eyes. Every customer in the diner noticed her immediately. The woman approached the counter calmly. I am looking for Clara Ellison. Clara folded her arms slowly. Depends who is asking. Vanessa Beaumont. The name landed heavily. Even Clara recognized it from the television coverage surrounding Nolan's canceled engagement. Vanessa glanced around the diner with visible discomfort. Charming place. Frank immediately walked away, muttering something about wanting witnesses if murder occurred. Clara stayed still. What do you want? Vanessa removed leather gloves carefully. Honestly, curiosity. Clara frowned. Vanessa smiled faintly. Nolan disappeared for nearly a week. Ignored investors. Ignored reporters. Ignored me. Her expression sharpened slightly. But apparently not you. Clara looked away briefly. You should probably ask him why. Vanessa leaned lightly against the counter. Oh, I know why. Her eyes scanned the diner slowly. You made him feel ordinary. The words surprised Clara enough to silence her. Vanessa laughed softly. You know the ironic thing about wealthy men, she said quietly. Most spend their lives desperate for someone who does not care about money. Clara crossed her arms tighter. And yet they never stop using it. For the first time, Vanessa actually looked impressed. Now I understand. Clara frowned slightly. Understand what? Vanessa smiled sadly this time. Why he chose honesty too late. Silence settled between them while snow drifted outside the windows. Then Vanessa reached into her purse and slid a folded envelope across the counter. Clara immediately pushed it back untouched. If that is money, absolutely not. It is not money. Vanessa nodded toward the envelope. It is an invitation. Clara hesitated before opening it carefully. A charity gala invitation printed on heavy cream paper. Whitaker Foundation Winter Benefit. Tonight. Downtown Chicago. Clara looked up immediately. No, Vanessa almost laughed. That was fast. I am not interested in becoming part of some billionaire apology tour. Vanessa's expression softened unexpectedly. Then do not go for him. Clara frowned. Vanessa glanced toward the windows thoughtfully. Go because that man spent years surrounded by people who applauded his wealth and ignored his soul. She looked back at Clara carefully. You are the first person who ever embarrassed him into becoming honest. Clara stared down at the invitation silently. He hurt me, she admitted quietly. Vanessa nodded once. Yes. Her voice carried no jealousy now, only tired understanding. But if Nolan Whitaker stands in front of an entire ballroom tonight and tells the truth publicly, she stepped back toward the diner entrance. Then maybe for once, his money will not be the bravest thing about him. The bell above the door rang softly as Vanessa disappeared into the snowy Chicago evening. Clara remained motionless behind the counter, staring at the invitation in her hands while Frank slowly approached beside her. Well, he muttered, this officially became richer than cable television. Clara laughed despite herself. Small, quiet, real. Then she looked down at the elegant invitation again, while somewhere deep inside her anger, something dangerous began softening into possibility. In the end, love is not about finding someone perfect. It is about finding someone honest enough to stay after the masks fall away. Snow drifted softly across downtown Chicago as black luxury cars lined the entrance of the Whitaker Foundation Winter Benefit. Cameras flashed against polished marble while wealthy donors stepped from limousines wrapped in diamonds, designer gowns, and carefully rehearsed smiles. Inside the ballroom, crystal chandeliers scattered golden light across hundreds of guests moving through the room, with champagne glasses balanced elegantly between perfectly manicured fingers. Nolan Whitaker stood near the stage adjusting his cuff links for the third time in 5 minutes. You are nervous, Daniel said beside him. Nolan stared across the ballroom. I have negotiated billion-dollar mergers without blinking. And yet one waitress reduced you to a philosophical crisis. Nolan almost smiled. Apparently. The orchestra played softly in the background while reporters gathered near the stage, expecting another polished billionaire speech about charity and corporate responsibility. Instead, Nolan felt like a man preparing to walk willingly into judgment. Because for the first time in his life, money could not solve the problem waiting in front of him. The ballroom doors opened quietly near the back of the room. Clara stepped inside wearing a simple dark blue dress she probably spent an hour convincing herself not to regret buying. Nothing flashy, nothing designed to impress anyone. And somehow she still looked more real than everyone else in the room combined. Nolan saw her instantly. Everything else disappeared. The orchestra, the conversations, the cameras. Just Clara standing beneath the chandelier lights looking slightly uncomfortable already. Several wealthy guests glanced toward her dismissively, before returning to their conversations. Nolan noticed that too. He noticed everything now. Clara spotted Vanessa near the entrance first. The elegant blonde smiled warmly. "You came." Clara looked around cautiously. "I am already regretting approximately 70% of this decision." Vanessa laughed softly. "That means there is hope." Before Clara could answer, murmurs suddenly spread across the ballroom. Nolan Whitaker had stepped onto the stage. The room quieted immediately. Reporters lifted cameras. Investors straightened posture. Nolan stood beneath the lights, staring out at hundreds of powerful people waiting for another controlled performance. Then his eyes found Clara near the back of the room. And suddenly the speech he prepared no longer mattered. "Good evening," Nolan began quietly. Tonight was originally supposed to be about charity. His voice echoed softly across the ballroom. "But lately I have learned that wealthy people are very good at donating money while withholding honesty." Several confused glances moved through the crowd. Daniel closed his eyes briefly, like a man watching disaster approach elegantly. Nolan continued calmly. "A few weeks ago, I disappeared because I wanted to know whether people still treated strangers with kindness when there was nothing to gain from them." Murmurs spread louder now. Camera flashes intensified. "So I lied." Silence. Sharp now. Honest. "I pretended to be poor." Somewhere near the front tables, several board members looked horrified. Vanessa simply sipped champagne like she already survived this emotional train wreck weeks ago. Nolan kept speaking. "And during that week, most people ignored me, judged me, avoided me." His eyes shifted toward Clara again. Except one waitress in a small diner on the south side of Chicago. Clara froze beneath dozens of curious glances turning toward her now. "She gave me coffee when she thought I had nothing." Nolan's voice softened slightly. "She trusted me with apartment keys before she knew my last name. She carried soup through snowstorms for strangers while working double shifts to support her father." The ballroom had gone completely silent. "And when she discovered who I really was," Nolan smiled faintly without humor. "She did not care about my money. She cared that I lied." Clara felt her throat tighten unexpectedly. Nolan stepped away from the podium slowly now. No rehearsed billionaire confidence left. Just honesty. Raw and uncomfortable. "For years I believed people loved wealth because wealth solved problems." He stopped directly in front of Clara beneath the chandelier lights. "But Clara Ellison taught me something humiliating." A tiny nervous laugh moved through the crowd. Nolan smiled slightly. "Money can buy attention. It can buy influence. It can even buy applause." His eyes stayed locked on hers. "But it cannot buy dignity from someone who already has her own." Clara looked down briefly, overwhelmed by the sincerity in his voice. Nolan continued quietly. "I was arrogant. I treated trust like something people had to earn from me." His expression softened completely now. "Meanwhile, you were feeding strangers, protecting your father, and surviving life with more grace than anyone in this room." Several wealthy guests shifted uncomfortably. "Good. So tonight," Nolan said gently, "I am done pretending." Silence lingered for one long heartbeat before Clara finally looked up at him. "You know," she said softly enough that nearby microphones barely caught it, "this might be the strangest apology in modern American history." Laughter rippled carefully through the ballroom. Even Nolan laughed quietly. Clara studied him for a moment longer. Not the billionaire from magazine covers. The man who carried potato boxes badly. The man who delivered soup in snowstorms. The man standing in front of hundreds of powerful people, choosing humiliation over pride. "You really are terrible at lying," she whispered. Nolan nodded once. "I know." Clara exhaled slowly while the entire ballroom practically stopped breathing around them. Then finally, gently, she stepped closer and took his hand. Applause erupted instantly across the room, but Nolan barely heard any of it. Because Clara was smiling again. Real smile. Tired. Warm. Dangerous to his sanity. "One condition," she murmured. Nolan frowned slightly. "Anything." Clara tilted her head. "If this turns into some billionaire fairy tale where you buy me a horse or an island, I am leaving immediately." Nolan laughed quietly through visible relief. "Understood." Clara squeezed his hand softly. "Good." Snow continued falling outside the ballroom windows while camera flashes sparkled across crystal chandeliers and expensive suits. But somehow the most beautiful thing in the room was not wealth, power, or elegance. It was two people finally standing in front of each other without pretending to be anyone else. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like, share it with someone who believes in true love, and let us know where you are watching from. And please subscribe to When He Chose Her channel for more emotional cinematic stories about love, dignity, and second chances. Your support helps us keep creating powerful stories that remind the world of kindness still matters. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next unforgettable story.